Welcome to our AP Legal Zone podcast, brought to you by AP Lawyers. We are your top picks for all weekly law updates, including family, immigration, wills, and estates law. Just a friendly reminder, we are not your lawyers, and everything contained in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not to be construed as legal advice. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay connected with any updates and get notified about our new episodes.
Hello, I'm Angela Princewill,
And I'm Sherine Abdi.
and today we will be talking to you about child support for adult children with addiction issues. It's going to be a short episode, but it's very important for you to pay attention to the tips we're going to be giving you here. If you have a child and you're going through a separation or divorce, child support is one of the issues that you're going to have to deal with. And I know this happens all the time in my practice, and I'm sure it happens with you, Sherine, as well, where people believe that if a child is over 18 years old, they no longer have to pay child support.
Yeah, that often it's a common misconception. Unfortunately, that is not true. And so I think specifically, Angela will talk about kind of what constitutes as a child for the purposes of child support.
So, under the Divorce Act and the Family Law Act, a child is a person that's under the age of majority and has not withdrawn from the charge of their parents. So, in Ontario, the age of majority is 18 years old. And a child that's 18 years or over that is still under the charge of their parents may still be eligible to get child for child support payments if they're unable to be self-reliant because of reasons of illness, disability, or other causes, and they need the parent support to obtain the necessities of life. Long story short, you can get child support if you're over the age of 18 and not able to be independent for legitimate reasons.
Yeah.
But today we just want to zoom in on one reason, and that's the reason of disability. Because we were just going through a recent decision that really kind of caught our interest, and it had to do with a case where a mom in this situation brought an application seeking child support for an adult child that was 20 years old, and the child had disabilities that the mom claimed, as well as addiction issues that the father had no issues with. So in this particular scenario, there's a few takeaways, and these are the main things we want you to leave this episode with. One is the importance of evidence, realizing that every issue would be decided on its own specific facts, and that the fact that a child has a disability in and of itself does not mean that they will get child support. So, Sherine, do you want to speak a little bit about, the case we were just looking over, the LMG case?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting case. As you said, mom brought an application to seek support from dad for what she claimed as a child that she was still trying to claim was entitled to support, specifically child support, of course. And her basis for doing so was that the child was suffering from mental illnesses, specifically some form of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, although weren't actually, from my understanding, weren't significant diagnoses, or there wasn't enough evidence tendered regarding those specific disorders. But in addition to that, the child had severe addiction issues and had used drugs in the past, and it was still reliant on drugs. So it wasn't a situation where they were rehabilitated or taking precautions or steps to kind of help them through that process. So in doing so, the child was actually also receiving ODSP, which is the Disability Support Program, for those of you that are unaware. And her main basis for seeking support was that the child qualified for ODSP, so therefore the child is disabled, and that's what essentially entitles mom to child support for her.
The courts wouldn't have that. The judge
Yeah.
said no. The judge said no. Receiving ODSP in and of itself
is not indicative of a disability.
Yeah.
So I think that was a big
Well, I
takeaway.
guess we should say it's indicative, but it doesn't dispose of the issues. It's
Yeah.
not. It doesn't just end there. Just because your child's receiving ODSP doesn't mean the judge is going to agree that from a legal perspective that's sufficient for them to continue to receive child support.
Yeah.
And
Um,
there were a
there
lot
were
of
a lot of
things.
circumstances. So specifically, the child was receiving the ODSP specifically. So and he was living at home, didn't have any rent to pay, lodging, any responsibilities for the home. And essentially, I think the court was more concerned that the mother was enabling, and that's what essentially the father had tendered evidence that mom was enabling his inability to be self sufficient.
Yeah, because he was using the ODSP payments to fund his
His
addictions, right?
exactly, and as opposed to her maybe managing those funds and helping with his addiction. Not to say that like she's to blame for any of that, but I think the important thing was it doesn't mean that there's no inability. It doesn't mean that the child should not be deemed inefficient or not self sufficient
Yeah.
for the purposes of support. Like he should have still been able to maybe use those monies to actually go out and seek aid, although they were using those resources. The biggest issue I think dad had was he wasn't disputing that child support would have been payable had his son gone back to school, had made efforts to be self-sufficient, and actually supported him throughout his degree.
Yeah.
He wasn't saying I would not be responsible or have an obligation to pay support. It was more so because mom is enabling this behavior, it's really just enabling the child to be not self sufficient. And so it's
Absolutely.
not fair that I have to pay support when he's also tendered evidence that he's tried to get him support and the son has not really been responsive to any of his attempts.
Yeah, I think it something I found interesting as well was the judge's observation of the parental alienation that happened in this case, and I wonder, if mom was kind of trying to be the good mom here. And honestly, if she really is an enabler, obviously I can't say she's being the good mom here, but you know what I mean, like somebody trying to, if this was her overcompensating and just trying to, was one way of trying to alienate the dad and not taking a hat stand and just giving tough love. That's essentially what this child needed, not allowing the child to be in the home. So I think a lot of every case, as we said, is fact specific. In different circumstances, it might the child support probably would have continued, but in this case, I think I side with the judge with this decision. And if I'm wrong, and maybe child support ought to have continued and all that, then it really comes back to the point I made initially, which is evidence, evidence, evidence. Because we're not in your homes, we don't understand your situation enough, and that's what the lawyer's job is. And or if you're self-represented, that's what your responsibility is, to put forward your best evidence and just make the case. If the child really does have schizophrenia, then put forth the best evidence possible. And that brings me to
Your
just
second point.
yeah, no, I mean, my main point, honestly, is just the evidence, and
Yeah.
just making sure that when you put forth your best evidence, and making sure that you don't think just because they're receiving an ODSP, for example, that
Then
that
it's a clean
settles.
cut case.
The burden of proof is always
Yes, and
important.
as a recipient, if you're asking for that support to be paid, you have the onus, you bear the burden of having to prove why that child is still a dependent child for
Mhm.
support purposes.
I think people sometimes forget the significance of the burden of proof that they have. If you're the one that has, in every case, you always have to look who's responsible for proving this. And as Sherine said, in a child support scenario for an adult child, the recipient has the responsibility of proving that child support needs to continue. So make sure that you have the proper evidence put together. Remember that you bear the burden, and if you don't discharge that burden properly, then your case, you're not going to get the decision that you probably ought to receive. And just never take anything for granted. Don't imagine that because the government thinks that your child should get ODSP, that the court's going to accept that as dispositive of the issue. And lastly, just the fact that the act says a child with disability is entitled to child support doesn't mean that it just ends there.
Mm-hmm.
Full circle again, burden of proof. And you
And
have to remember that some people who are disabled are able to still make a contribution to themselves.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the judge's comments that, not every disabled person, and this is also taken with a grain of salt, of course, because mental health issues are a serious concern. So, not to give any
Absolutely.
disrespect to that, but specifically, the judge says there are a lot of people that suffer with mental health illnesses and issues, but that doesn't not enable them to go out and be high functioning members of society, go out and get jobs and be self sufficient.
Yeah, so again comes back to the whole evidence
Yeah.
thing, right? So if your child is one of those children that are unable to become self-supporting because of their mental health issues, absolutely they deserve the support of both parents, and that's why you have to put the proper evidence forward. Anyway, that's all we have to say on this topic. I hope we're not beating a dead horse.
Thank you so much for joining us.
And we look forward to bringing more exciting family law topics your way soon.
Thanks for listening and joining us in the AP Legal Zone. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find more episodes by searching AP Legal Zone on anywhere you watch podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast today so you can stay connected with any updates and get notified about any new episodes.